Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And tonight we'll be talking about something that's in the news a lot these days, and that is the subject of refugees. There are, by some estimates, 65 or more million refugees in the world today, staying in various refugee camps around the world. So our guest tonight is Peter Magai Bul.
Yes.
And Peter, you were in refugee camp for many years. In fact, you have a very interesting story to tell about your background. Those who may be familiar with the story of the Lost Boys of Sudan, you were one of them.
Yes.
And
Yes.
you spent years fighting your way through the desert on foot, only to find yourself in a refugee camp for, what was it, 10 years?
Yeah, so past 4 years in Ethiopia and then 9 years in Kenya.
Yeah. So let's start, your story is so fascinating. Let's start from the beginning,
Well,
when you left your village.
Thank Kevin for having me. Happy to be here and share my story. I was born in a small village called Pongbrong in South Sudan in 1982.
At that time, it was all part of the larger country of Sudan,
Yeah, it
right?
was Sudan, and I lived in the village with my dad and my mom. I came at number 10 in our family, so I came from a very big family. My family were rich. I came from the Dinka ethnic group, and Dinka were farmers. They keep cattle. So my father have hundreds of cows, and we have farm. So we live a very good life. We have everything that we need. And unfortunately, the war in Sudan start when Sudan get independent from Great British. So the war started. That war went on for 11 years. And then in 1972, there was a peace agreement, and there was a break. And then in 1983, the war broke out again. And unfortunately, this war was later displaced in 1988. And what happened that year?
Now that war in '83, that was a war where the North and South were separating?
Yeah, that was, Southern finally, after the peace agreement collapsed, and when oil was discovered, and then the Sudanese government imposing Sharia law, Southerners decided to take up arms against the government. And so that war actually started in 1983, and that the war that lasted for 21 years, and that, led to the independence of South Sudan later on in 2011. So what happened that year, I remember when I was a little boy, our village were close to the Nile. So in December of 1987, I left my family and went to the cattle camp. Cattle camp during the dry season were mostly on the Nile. So I was
Nile
there,
River?
usually between December and May. That's during the dry season. So I was at the cattle camp for those months, and then at the raining season, we start moving back with our cattle to the village. But that year, there was a flood, and that displaced people. So instead of going to the village and stay with my family, we then moved with the cattle to another area, of which we were there for another 7 months.
So you were unable to go rejoin your family?
So I wasn't
right?
able to go to the family because of the flood. So I lived with my brother, and we stay at another location for 7 months. In December, as water was drying up, we tried to move back to the village. But unfortunately, because of the war and the recruitment by the soldiers of the Sudanese Liberation Army that were fighting the government, I had to live with my mom. And so that was the beginning of my journey.
Because they would have recruited you as a...
Yeah.
But you were still a very young boy at
I
that
was
time.
a very young, I was 7 years old.
And they would have recruited you into the army anyway, even at the age of 7.
Yeah, or if the Sudanese government attack villages, they would burn down villages, they will capture children, they would either kill you. And so it was better for me to live. And I started the journey with my mom, but she couldn't make the journey. And 7 days later, her leg was swollen, So instead of continuing the journey, she had to return back to the village. And then that was the last time I saw my mom and the rest of my family. The journey took about 2 to 3 months.
And where were you headed with this journey? Where was your destination?
At that time, we were young. We didn't know where we were going. We just kept walking. We walk at night, and then during the day, we would hide under the tree, and then we kept walking. I didn't know where we were going back then, but we later ended up in Ethiopia. And so yes, there were children who went there before me, and then I came in '88, and many children continue to come. So there were 3 refugee camps
And these, when you
Ethiopia.
were walking this for months at a time, there were no adults in this group, right? They were just...
Yeah, there were no adults. Mostly adults were, if there were few adults who were with us, they were asked to go back to the village because you can't leave your home.
Right.
They have cattle, they have farm, so they
Right.
were told to return to the village and then let these children go to maybe a place where they may be secure.
Right.
But unfortunately, when we end up in Ethiopia, there was nobody there to care for us, so many children died along the way, and then when we were in refugee camp, we have no food. We didn't even have a place to sleep. There were disease. And so children continue to die in the refugee camp, but in Ethiopia, we organize ourselves into group of 50 to group of 100 to 1,000, and leaders were assigned to take care of these children. And when you are assigned to a group of 100 boys or 500 or 1,000, you become like a parent to these children, meaning you would have to make decision about, burying the children whom we lost, sending some children to go and find something, food, either whatever vegetation we could find, or some would go and fish. So duties like that were mostly carried out.
And were you one of these leaders who was appointed?
Yeah, I started with a small group of 30, at the age of 10, and then you get promoted as you perform, to the people's expectations. So.
Now, having never visited a refugee camp, I have no physical image. I don't know what they look like. I don't know how they're run, who's in charge. So tell me a little bit about the life in the refugee camp. So you were in Ethiopia for, was it 4 years? In the refugee
4 years.
camp?
When we were in Ethiopia, I'm not sure if that would really qualify as the refugee camp, because in Ethiopia, we were the only people taking care of ourselves. When we got there, there were no international organization taking care of us. So it was just up to us to, to find a way to survive. And later on, organizations like Red Cross came, but that was in '91 when we were leaving Ethiopia because of the war. And so it was actually Kakuma refugee camp where I lived for 9 years. That's where you have, different, such as the UNHCR World Food Program.
But that was in...
yeah, that was in Kenya,
Kenya, right.
4 years later.
Yeah.
And I lived in Kenya refugee camp for 9 years.
So a total of 13 years.
Yes.
So again, I'm just astonished that that people survive that at all. But going back to your time in Ethiopia, you all had to figure out how to survive on your own. But you were only 7 when you got there, right? Or 8?
Well, the youngest, we had kids who were 6 years old. The oldest were about 12 or 13.
That's still not very
yeah,
old.
so all of us were young.
Yeah.
And when you are put in a situation where you have no choice, you just have to figure out the way to live. And I remember when I was in Ethiopia, you just worry about every day seeing children dying, and you wonder whether you would be the next person to go. But we do everything to take care of ourselves. If we had food, the leaders would have to make sure every child have something to eat. So we have to share everything, and we have to take care of ourselves. Even the job that children normally don't do, like burying those children,
right.
they were an adult. We have to go and dig the grave and bury those children. And so life was really tough in Ethiopia. Of course, in Ethiopia there were people, but we came from the culture. where we, you could go and beg Ethiopian for food, but in our culture, it's hard to beg, and there were many of us,
Yeah.
100 of us. So who
Yeah,
is going,
very hard to
go
do.
to the village and try
Yeah.
to find something?
How did you maintain your spirit? I mean, how did you keep hope alive in such dire circumstances?
Well, there were a number of things. First of all, most of us, as I mentioned earlier, when we were with our parent or in the village, there were times where you would have to leave your parent and go at the cattle camp.
Okay.
And so when you are at the cattle camp,
You're on your own.
you are taking care of cow. You are taking them out for grazing. You are on your own. You basically survive on milk. Your mom is not there to cook for you.
Right.
And at the cattle camp, there are no buildings sometimes. So if it rains, you would have to find a shelter. So we were exposed to that life where we would have to do everything, to take care of ourselves. And there was that mentality in the village that if you are a boy, you have to be tough. And later on, when we find ourselves with all this group of children, competition became the biggest thing. And I remember when we used to work, if you came late, the children would be there waiting for you, and they would make fun of you. Why are you the last person to show up? So when you see other children, taking care of themselves, and you don't want to be the kid, giving up in that situation. And in fact, we didn't have any choice. You give up, that's the end of your life. Unless you try to do whatever it takes, and then we also look after one another. I think that was the biggest thing. We share almost everything. So.
Well, I think that's also remarkable that there's a feeling that the pessimistic view of humanity is that we're all competitors and we'll do whatever we can, and it doesn't matter what happens to anybody else, I'm out for myself.
Yes.
But in fact, your experience was the opposite, that when the situation was truly dire, the kids pulled together and they watched out for each other and they helped each other.
Right.
And it's a remarkable comment on humanity. It's a good thing to hear.
And one of the things that helped when we settled in Ethiopia, probably the Sudanese Liberation Army, they would send some representative to those camps. And there was an idea later that all these children have to go to a military camp where we have to do the training.
For the Ethiopian army or for the Sudanese?
For the South Sudanese army. Probably that was an agreement between the Sudanese Liberation Army and the Ethiopian government. So we did 6 months to 1 year military training. And when you are in the military, it is all about being tough. It's all about being loyal, to the country.
Right.
And
following orders.
And so whatever value that we have learned as we did that military training, I think that also helped us. And I remember some years later, the SPLM that was fighting the Sudanese government, they would still come and visit the camp. And they would ask kids, if you want to voluntarily leave the refugee camp and go back to Sudan and be able to join the army since you have the training, there were children who were willing to leave to leave that refugee camp. And I remember those years, I had the height, I was tall, and there were times I would put on a lot of clothes to look bigger. Then I would go to this military person and I say, I'm ready to go, because you just worry, you just don't want to die idle in refugee camp.
Yeah.
There was this mentality, I would rather die fighting for my home country, defending my village. But we were discouraged, and they would tell us, wait for some years, and if you are ready, you could join the military. And so we were actually called the Red Army. The name Lost Boy, actually, we got it when we came to the United States. So yes.
So it was called the Red Army?
Yeah, so that did help.
So then you left Ethiopia, though, and went to Kenya. And what prompted that? Why did that move happen?
Yes, in '91, the government of that day was overthrown, and now you have a new government that took over. And that government didn't want us in Ethiopia. So they began to attack us from 3 places that we were in. And So we had to live at gunpoint. And unfortunately, as we tried to go back to Sudan, there was this river called River Gilo at the border of Ethiopia and Sudan. That river, you could cross it any time, but that particular time, there was rain, and that river was overflow.
And so you
And
physically
we came
couldn't.
to the river, and now the choice, either you have to jump to the river with the hope to cross it, or if you go back and you are captured, or you might get killed. So we had a choice to make at that particular time. So thousands of children died trying to cross the river to Sudan.
Thousands?
Yeah, and when we even across the river and try to settle in Sudan at the border, the Sudanese government heard about the children who made it back to Sudan, and now they begin to send their troops that later attack us, and we had to leave, and that's so.
So
And,
you, so
and
you had
we
to-
ended up in Kenya in 1992 because of.
And did you have, again, all this was on foot. You had to walk to get to
Yes, yes. It's only when we were going to Kenya, there were Red Cross who helped the younger one, and those who were sick and couldn't make the journey, they would come with truck that they normally transport food,
Kenya.
and so they will just, as children to just pile up on those trucks, and
And they would take you to the
yeah,
camps.
and they would take you to the next destination. So, but those were, they were also helping those who couldn't make the journey, especially the one who got sick along the way.
So then you spent the next 9 years in Kenya. How did you manage to get an education in the camp?
Yeah, I think we were the first to open Kakuma refugee camp in 1992. We come, and Kenya was, like a desert. And so we started the camp there. We started building our houses. There were refugees from Ethiopia who joined us there, refugees from Somalia, from Burundi. And then when the Rwanda genocide happened in 94, you also have refugees from Rwanda. So there were refugees from the region that joined us later in Kakuma refugee camp. And different international organizations came to the camp, UNHCR, World Food Program, and different organizations. So some organizations help with water. Organizations like the UNICEF, they would help with the school. And so when we started the school in Kakuma, we were taught under the tree.
Did you guys started your own school?
Yeah, we started, they would, if there were teachers, they would have those teachers to teach us under the tree.
Because there were so many refugees that
Yeah,
some
there
were
were so
likely
many
to
refugees.
be
And
teachers.
so
right?
when we started the school, I remember you have to go and sit under the tree, and you have to level the soil in front of you, and you write ABCDs on the soil, and that is your exercise book, because we didn't have
Nothing else.
Yeah, and we were very grateful to start learning. And then later on, there were classes, but then we lacked the teachers. And so those who made it to secondary school or high school would teach in primary school. So that's how, so we continued to learn. And
So at some point, though, you must have had access to books or something to help you. I mean,
yeah,
you can't write in the dirt for 9 years.
right. Well, at first, the teacher would write something on the blackboard, and you will memorize them. You write them on the soil, and you would memorize them. And then later on, there were classes, and they start bringing book and exercise book. And there were few libraries built, and there were so many children. So some would go. So you would just make a schedule. You would go to the library all night to have access to the book. And so things continued to improve as we live in that refugee camp.
And it's from what I understand that's a fortunate circumstance. There are many camps today around the world where there is no access to education.
Yep.
And so the kids will grow up with no schooling. And then if they're stuck there for years and they get to be young adults with no education or they can't read or write, that's a huge drawback.
Well, imagine me, I left Kakuma refugee camp in 201.
Mm-hmm.
That was the year I came to the United States. But I settled in Kakuma in 1992. Now there are people I left in that camp in 2001, and they came with me in 1992. So you're talking about people who have been in that camp for 26 years.
Wow.
And there are children who were born there, and they don't know any other place other than that refugee camp. And when you talk about all these refugees from different countries
Mm-hmm.
competing for almost everything, I mean, it's a sad reality. And refugee camp are just like the prison, in my opinion. You don't even know where your food gonna come from. You just hope that the donors, whether they are countries or individuals who always donate to organizations like UNHCR, would continue to do their part. Otherwise, when I was in a refugee camp, there were times you would go for 2 days without eating.
Because there was no food.
Because there was no food. And if you had food anyway, we used to make sure we budget properly. So if you eat lunch, you would have to avoid breakfast and dinner, and you would have to wait for the next day to eat again the lunch. And that food was not even enough. And so
So
when you hear about 68.5 million refugees,
yes.
of which South Sudan is the third country with the largest number of refugees, it breaks my heart, that people have been forced to live in such a situation.
So how did you manage to escape that and get to the United States?
What happened when we were going to school in Kakuma, it was during the Bill Clinton administration that the United States decided to take some of those children whom have been moving from country to country without parents. And so what happened that year, there were people from the United States who were sent to collect our histories. And so they would have us write one page of your history. They would collect those histories. And then in 98, they were knew that the United States is taking some of the Lost Boys. And that was actually the time we were given that title.
Right.
Because when they collected these stories and they learned that you haven't, you left your parents in the 80s and you haven't had a chance to see them, you don't even know whether they survived the war, and you don't even know where they are. That's how we end up with the title, The Lost Boy. So that program started. At first we couldn't believe it, but we just want to give it a chance anyway. Later on, they came back and do the interview. So they would come back with the same history you have written, and they would ask you question about that history, and you would tell them whatever you could tell them. And then some month later, they would give you an envelope. Either you are rejected to come to the United States or you are accepted to come to the United States. Because by numbers, when we were in Ethiopia, there were a total of 26,000 children. About more than 1,200 made it to Kenya, and majority of, almost half died from the things I mentioned earlier. But all 12,000 who were in a refugee camp were given a chance to do the interview, and the United States was only looking for 4,000 to resettle in the United States. So, but everybody was given a chance.
Right.
People like myself who were in charge of this, taking care of these children, they would basically know if you came to the United States, you would probably do well with your life and be able to think about those refugees, because if you were able to take care of them all these years, then there is a chance that you could think about them and be able to help them. And so when you get help to come to the United States, they would expect you to also help other refugees who remain behind. And so nearly 3,800 of us came to the United States in 2001.
Here in Chicago, or was it?
No, about 120 of us came to Chicago, but there are Lost Boys in 38 other states.
Locations, yeah.
Yeah.
And so you have, in fact, given back. Now, you co-founded an elementary school back in your home village. And by the way, I should let our audience know that you were able to go back and visit your mother, who was still alive,
Right.
and you were able to see her.
Yeah, this idea, when I got my U.S. citizenship in October of 2007, I decided it was now time for me to go back and see my family because I haven't seen them for 19 years. The first time I talked to my mom, it was 2004. I had a brother who was in the military. I connected with him before I came to the United States, and when I came to America, I later, call him, and I asked him about the family. So he went to the village, got my mom, brought her to Kenya, and I called her, and she couldn't believe if that's me, but I say, well, I survived, that's me.
Yeah.
Who knows, God may made it possible for me to see you.
Yeah.
So in December of 2007, I left with two of my American friends, left Chicago here in December and arrived at the village on Christmas Eve. I remember there were people celebrating the birth of Christ when we arrived that evening. And I went home, finally meet my mom for the first time. So the rest of my brothers and sisters, except my father, who was then
Your father had
died in
passed away.
91 during the war. So when I went back, that was the only person I couldn't see, but I was able to see my mom and my brothers. So the idea of the school came about when I had a chance to visit my family. I was taken to a nearby place, Phongbrong, which was an area I used to play when I was a little boy. And I remember being welcomed by the children. They were clapping, they were singing. And I went to the school, and a representative from the school, give the